Good morning, everyone. I'm greeting you in joining this webinar this morning. The title is Regional Order and Institutions in the Indo-Pacific, Canadian and Asian Perspectives. This is the first of two webinars today organized by the Asia-Pacific team of the Defense and Security Foresight Group under the auspices of the MINDS program. I begin by acknowledging that UBC's Point Grey campus, from which I'm speaking, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Others of you will be joining from the territorial homes of many other Aboriginal nations, which we join in acknowledging as well. By way of introduction, and I think a webinar or a discussion of Asia-Pacific security at this time really doesn't need to have persons drawn to it, because it's been a year of remarkable activity and change across the Asia-Pacific. Bilateral, multilateral regional architecture is being transformed in the context of strategic competition between the US and China, the formation of alliances, China-Taiwanese tensions, North Korea provocations, all of this within the ongoing COVID pandemic. And as a result, all states, including perhaps especially Southeast Asian and middle powers such as Canada and Australia, face very difficult policy dilemmas. We have the privilege today of working with 5 experts to inform and focus our discussion. Each will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, after which we'll move to a give and take 30-minute Q&A session, drawing inspiration from your questions as you post them in the Q&A section, which you will see a button for on your screen. Also, I should note that this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing and watching within a week or so. I'll introduce our panelists to start, and they will proceed to present in this same order. First, we have Jeffrey Reeves. He's Vice President of Research and Security for the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Previously, he was Director of Asian Studies at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His wide experience in Asia, including, which I didn't know, in the Peace Corps in Mongolia, and also an instructor at Peking University. He's published extensively, and we await a forthcoming book on regional security, of which I expect Jeff will get a preview today. Secondly, we're delighted to have with us Elina Noor, Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director, Washington, D.C.'s Office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. She's a native of Malaysia and previously served as Director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies at ISIS Malaysia, and subsequently at the Asia Pacific Security Studies Center in Hawaii. Elina's work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance, and especially then issues related to cyber and cybercrime. Third, we have Kristen Hopewell, a colleague here at the University of British Columbia, an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Her research specializes in international trade, global governance, industrial policy and development, focuses on emerging powers, especially China. She's the author of 2 books with Cambridge and Stanford University presses, as well as several award-winning articles on international political economy. Next, we have Jennifer Mustapha, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Huron University at Western. Jennifer's research considers how ideas and institutions matter in construction of identity and governance. Her 2019 book focused on narratives of security in Southeast Asia in the context, among other things, of the US-led war on terror. And finally, batting cleanup, as it were, we have Shaun Narine. I think he's having some difficulty joining, but hope he does as we go along. He's Professor of International Relations in Political Science Department at St. Thomas University. His research focuses on institutionalization in the Asia-Pacific region, published 2 books on ASEAN, and written widely academic and op-ed pieces including on Canadian foreign policy. I took the trouble to give these introductions with a little, if you will, background information because it highlights, I think, the diversity of perspectives and expertise that we have in this webinar. And it's great to begin with you, Jeff, in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Job. As Professor Job mentioned, I'm Jeff Reeves, and I'm the Vice President for Research at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Professor Job asked me to set the scene for subsequent discussions, as it were, by outlining what I see as the predominant developments in the Asia-Pacific with respect to the region's order and great power relations. Now, this is a big topic to cover in the limited time we have today, and one I think we'll touch on throughout the rest of the presentations and question and answer period in more detail. So rather than attempt to articulate my perspective on the region's grand design, I'm going to limit my comments today to 5 observations around Asia's order that provide us the building blocks for further analysis. Now, I'll speed through these for the sake of time to leave more time at the end for discussion. So here's my overview of Asia in 5 strategic points. First, Asia, specifically the Asia-Pacific, is becoming more integrated and consolidated through economic development, through regional commercial networks, regional specific free trade agreements, such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, through reshoring of supply and value chains, a process supercharged by the COVID-19 pandemic, and through regionally driven economic development and integration plans, such as the China's Belt and Road Initiative, ASEAN's Community Vision 2025, South Korea's New Southern Policy, Taiwan's New Southbound Policy, India's Act East policy, and even Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific policy, which prioritizes interconnectivity and integration between Northeast and Southeast Asia as one of its key priorities. Now, in practical terms, this means we're seeing intra-regional trade and investment expand as states like China, India, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea replace traditional Western providers as sources of foreign direct investment and become regional drivers of growth and integration. Now, far from expanding, from my perspective, into an Indo-Pacific region, as many Western commentators would suggest, what we're actually seeing, in no uncertain terms, is a regional consolidation where the Asia-Pacific is becoming more tied together with physical and institutional networks that do not expand to the Indian Ocean area, and even fail to fully integrate India into the region, which brings me to the next point. 2, the Asia-Pacific is becoming more institutionally integrated, the result of its economic development. Starting with ASEAN, which is a far more dense, multidimensional, and action-oriented institution than outsiders typically give it credit for, and spreading to institutions like the Lansang-Mekong Cooperation Forum, the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, or BIMSTEC, the Belt and Road Forum, the Tumen River Initiative, among others. Now, again, in practical terms, this means Asia-Pacific states are developing regional endogenous institutions addressing strategic, political, environmental, and social issues to support their economic integration. Now, many of these institutions lack Western state participation as a matter of principle. Xi Jinping used the keynote to the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia in 2014, for instance, to call for a new Asian security concept, one where Asian states sought Asian solutions to Asian problems. Now, importantly, it's this institution building within Asia that many Western scholars and analysts identify when they're referring to Chinese revisionism in Asia, or when arguing Western state intervention and involvement in the Indo-Pacific is necessary to ensure its rules-based order. And indeed, order preservation is now the rallying cry for Western states' cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, up to and including the dispatching of advanced warships from the UK, France, and Germany to the South China Sea to push against Chinese revisionism. Now, all this despite the fact that Asian states have developed these institutions to meet Asian states' interests, to reflect Asian state values, and to encourage stability within the Asian region, including on matters related to the South China Sea. Now, indeed, China and ASEAN member states are engaged in negotiations, for instance, a round of code of conduct for the South China Sea, a negotiation most regional states see as the only real way to ensure regional maritime security and conflict prevention in the region, according to regional scholarship and polling. Third, the Asia-Pacific's consolidation is leading to a rise in nationalism across the region. As states in Southeast Asia become more affluent and gain in stature as regional centers of economic growth and diplomacy, for example, and as national identities gain an appeal over more localized identities, and as common languages replace regional dialects, we're seeing stronger national identities emerge predicated on self-determination, self-possession, and self-confidence. Now, some scholars suggest Asian states' perceptions of Western failure around the global financial crisis, around political leadership and democracy, exemplified by the Trump presidency and the Brexit vote, and most relevant around the West's abject failure to manage the COVID pandemic, has also driven a biopolitical nationalism across the region, a nationalism based on the belief that the West is in decline and Asia is rising in the post-COVID era. Now, other scholars, such as John Seidel at the London School of Economics, point to the enduring quality anti-colonialism plays in modern Asian nationalism, including in developing states like Japan and South Korea, but most notably in Southeast Asian states, many of which were Western colonies. Now, indeed, for anyone doubting the ongoing salience of anti-colonialism and Asian discourse around Western states in particular, I'd suggest you read media reporting from Indonesia and Malaysia about Australia's decision to deploy and develop nuclear submarines to the South China Sea. There is a significant narrative throughout the region, for instance, that labels Australia an outsider power intent on working through an Anglo-Saxon coalition to ensure Western hegemony in Asia, even at the cost of Southeast Asian stability. Now, this brings me to my fourth point, which is that Western state engagement in the Asia-Pacific, particularly engagement aligned around an Indo-Pacific view of the region, runs counter to regional narratives, assumptions, institutions, and trends. Now, whereas Western states, including Australia, France, Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and Western aligned states like Japan now reference the need to support a rules-based order in Asia to justify military deployment and security-based coalitions to Asia, we see little support for such activities within the Asia-Pacific. Incidentally, we can trace language around a rules-based order back to George Kennan's containment strategy and the first Bush administration's diplomacy around the first Gulf War. While Asian states are committed to a rule of law, for instance, they are not wedded to the idea of a fixed rules-based order, particularly one dominated by US hegemony and based on liberal Western values. Now, neither does one see a drive for an Indo-Pacific redesign in the Asia-Pacific. Rather, one sees a clear preference of the Asia-Pacific to remain the strategic geopolitical and geoeconomic reference point. Now, ASEAN, to be certain, has published an Indo-Pacific outlook, but close reading of that document and Southeast Asian commentary on the outlook suggests the organization did this as a defensive maneuver, particularly to show what the Indo-Pacific was not. Now, neither does one find broad Asia-Pacific support for concepts essential to the Western Indo-Pacific state model, like the like-minded state or freedom and openness. Now, this is not to suggest Asia-Pacific states don't want freedom and openness, but rather that they see their usage within the Indo-Pacific paradigm as synonymous with continued Western hegemony, or the Western assumption that states like the US, France, and the UK have the right to fly, sail, and operate wherever they want in the Asia-Pacific. Now, the fifth point I'd raise here is that Canadian involvement in a Western-led or Western-aligned Indo-Pacific strategy would place it firmly on the outside of regional sentiments, developments, and narratives. As I mentioned above, it's the Asia-Pacific, not the Indo-Pacific, that is consolidating in terms of material ties, institutional networks, and even normative developments. It's the Asia-Pacific that is becoming more wealthy and more central to global growth, not the Indo-Pacific, which remains primarily an imagined region with the intent of fostering Western security partnerships such as the Quad or the Quad Plus, both of which incidentally bear a scarily similar membership construct to the Cold War area, SATO. And it's the Asia-Pacific states, including China, that will determine the shape and nature of the region and state engagement within the region in the future. Aligning with an Indo-Pacific strategy, Canada will instead be casting its lot with former Asian colonial states, many of which are striving to preserve a vision of regional and global order that does not match with regional trends, relationships, or developments. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thanks very much, Jeff. A perfectly timed presentation, concise, and I think sets the stage for several of our next participants. And Elina, you are next, please.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks for having me on this panel. Jeff has provided this masterful overview of the region in 5 points. So let me zoom in on Southeast Asia in 3 points. My first point deals with the ASEAN architecture, and I think it's important for us to step back and recall what the value of the ASEAN-led architecture means for the region. And the main value of it, since the founding of ASEAN in 1967, has been to craft a sense of agency in an uncertain regional and even global environment. This was true in the 60s, it remains true today. Now, how ASEAN has dealt with these uncertainties and political developments over the years has, of course, been the subject of a great amount of debate, which I don't intend to rehash here. But suffice to say, I think that that quest for agency remains crucial for many Southeast Asian states, given the diversity of their forms of government, their historical contexts, as well as their projected priorities and agendas for the future. And I think you see this most significantly perhaps in this tussle between the US and China in competing efforts such as the BRI on China's side and the Biden-Harris administration's initiatives, including the B3W, Build Back Better World. Of course, a lot of the US's initiatives in the recent past has been seen as an effort to counter China's influence in the region. A lot of the US's initiatives are also very explicitly underpinned by a values-based approach, which sits a bit awkwardly in the region given the political agnosticism amongst the 10 ASEAN member states towards ideology. And given the checkered history of how this competition for ideology played out, particularly during the Cold War, there's a bit of an aversion to being entrapped in that scenario all over again. And Jeff spoke about this so well. So that was my first point, this idea of agency that continues to grip ASEAN member states even till today. And even in this era of pandemic, it's very unfortunate that this competition continues to play out in the space of global health, as well as, to a certain extent, climate change. My second point intends to more specifically detail how this struggle for agency is playing out, particularly with the establishment or the revitalization of the Quad and the newly announced trilateral AUKUS. The Quad, of course, is not new, but I think the symmetry that we've witnessed in the past year has engendered a certain amount of concern in the ASEAN region, and that has only been exacerbated by the announcement of AUKUS. I know that both these minilaterals have pledged support for ASEAN centrality, and to a certain extent, that rhetoric has allayed some ASEAN member states. But I think if we dig deeper and try to understand what the end goals are to the Quad and to AUKUS, reality doesn't quite seem to match up with the rhetoric of support for ASEAN centrality. The fact remains that these two arrangements do not include any ASEAN countries. And that's not necessarily a problem in itself. If we think of ASEAN as a complex, as a modular complex of sorts, countries are free to come up with their own minilateral arrangements. But there is a dissonance between what support for ASEAN centrality means in practice and what it will mean in the long term, particularly when areas of cooperation in the Quad and AUKUS, such as global public health, are also fields of competition between the US and China. My third point, sorry, before I move on to my third point, and Jeff mentioned this also, there is all the optics of how AUKUS looks to post-colonial states in Southeast Asia. This look of an Anglo-American arrangement does not bode very well, I think, particularly with the US's statements on a foreign policy based on humility and the recognition that the US has a lot more to do in terms of reckoning with its own past. It's almost, if you're a Star Wars fan, it almost harkens to the tagline, you know, it's the return of the Empire Strikes Back. And so the optics, I feel, wasn't particularly well thought through. And maybe it was, and countries just didn't really care about it, which then leads us to a different set of problems. But my third and final point relates to what arrangements like the Quad and AUKUS mean for the future of the region, particularly for Southeast Asian states and ASEAN as a grouping. If we look at the contents of the Quad and AUKUS statements, we'll see that a lot of it is premised on the future, and a future that is anchored by science and technology. There's a lot of talk about quantum and cyberspace, even space. And these will be huge areas of competition if they're already not beginning to emerge as such for Southeast Asia. We all know that Southeast Asia is a key fulcrum in many of the technological supply chains. We see this even now playing out with many of the factories in Southeast Asia being closed, plugging the or being stopgaps to some of the supply chain issues around the world. With more Southeast Asian economies premising the digital growth on this era of technology, I think what we'll continue to see is competition over the standards and governance frameworks that will determine how these technologies are operated, are operationalized, and even designed and constructed. And the big question for Southeast Asia is how much of that future will Southeast Asian states have in crafting? A lot of Southeast Asia is a contributing bit player to global technology, but it is also a huge market for and consumer of technology that is primarily imported from other parts of the world, particularly in the global north. Now, if 80% of the world lives outside the US and China, shouldn't 80% of the world have at least a proportionate say in how technology is sold and marketed and designed and built for it? And I think that's one of the key questions that many Southeast Asian governments and other stakeholders will have to increasingly grapple with as digitalization becomes more of a reality for all of us. So let me end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elina. Picking up very nicely on several of Jeff's points. And I'm quite sure that Kristen, as our next speaker, will focus more on the economic side of relations in the region. So Kristen, the floor is yours.
Great. First of all, thanks, Brian, for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. I'm going to focus on the economic and trade dimensions of recent developments in the region. One of the most striking developments we've seen is China using trade and investment to project its power and expand its influence in the region. We've seen this very strikingly with the massive investments that China has been making through the BRI, which is unprecedented in its scale and scope. We've also seen this through the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which really has shown China as capable of exercising leadership in regional economic governance, and also of creating and leading a major multilateral economic institution that's capable of functioning as an alternative to the US-dominated Bretton Woods institutions. And that's also shown that China could successfully attract followers for its initiative including many US allies that were willing to defy the US and risk incurring its wrath by joining the AIIB. And we've also seen this in ambitious free trade agreements like Rsep and most recently China's bid to join the CPTPP. So China is in many ways responding to the vacuum that's been left by the US, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and really having little in the way of a coherent economic and trade strategy for the region in recent years. This has really left the field open to China, who's been a huge beneficiary of US disengagement and of the way in which the US has alienated and antagonized many countries in the region during the Trump administration. So I'm going to focus on the two key trade agreements in the region at the moment, starting with Rsep. There's been a lot of skepticism, particularly when Rsep was first launched. It was seen sort of as a poor imitation of the US-led TPP. And there were a lot of doubts about whether it would even successfully be concluded. But I think many have underestimated the significance of the agreement. Rsep is one of the world's largest trade agreements now, covering nearly a third of the world's population and economy. And this is a landmark agreement in many ways. Its significance is not just economic, but also geopolitical, signaling China's increasing centrality in global trade rulemaking, as well as the growing marginalization of the US. So Rsep will serve to reduce tariffs on many goods, harmonize and streamline customs procedures, cutting red tape and reducing the cost of doing business in the region, and also strengthen Asian supply chains, boosting their competitiveness in global markets. So the pact is an important step towards deepening economic integration in the region and moving Asia-Pacific closer to being a coherent trade zone along the lines of North America or the EU. Although Rsep is not as ambitious in the breadth or the depth of its rules as other recent agreements, such as the TPP, it's achieved immense geographic reach and scale, encompassing a wide range of countries at vastly different levels of development. And that in itself is quite a significant accomplishment. Additionally, one of the most important aspects of Rsep is that it will replace the patchwork of bilateral agreements currently governing trade in the region with a common set of rules, including a unified rules of origin framework. And this is important because since any given product is usually comprised of inputs from many different countries, rules of origin are used to determine whether that product qualifies for preferential treatment under a free trade agreement. So Rsep's unified rules of origin will make it considerably easier for products made in its member countries to access other markets in the region at low or no tariffs. As a result, Rsep will significantly boost trade and production within Asia, generating an estimated $200 billion in economic gains annually. And the majority of those gains will accrue to its three largest participants, China, Japan, and Korea. Another important aspect of the agreement is that it represents the first free trade agreement amongst those three countries, these three Asian economic powerhouses whose previous efforts to foster increased economic cooperation have been limited by longstanding political tensions. So Rsep will serve to pull countries closer into China's orbit, cementing its central position in regional and global supply chains and bolstering its growing economic dominance in the Asia-Pacific region. This will only further accelerate the trend that we're seeing, with the world's economic center of gravity, once centered on the transatlantic powers of the US and EU, increasingly shifting towards China and the Asia-Pacific. China became the world's largest trading nation in 2013, and 2/3 of countries around the world now trade more with China than they do with the US. And that's something that will only increase with Rsep and other initiatives like the BRI and the AIIB. The other major development we've seen is China's announcement last month that it's officially applied to join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the agreement's 11 existing members, including Canada, must now decide whether to admit China. Joining the trade pact would be a major symbolic and strategic victory for China. This is the agreement that originated as the cornerstone of US strategy for containing China's growing influence in the Asia-Pacific region. And now that the US has dropped out, China is effectively seeking to step in and replace the US as the economic hub at the center of the agreement. So this would be a diplomatic coup for China and significantly increase its clout. It's highly unlikely that China would be able to meet the high standards of the agreement, but China's economic weight exceeds that of all of the existing CPTPP members put together, and it's the largest export market for the majority of CPTPP countries. So these states can be expected to come under substantial pressure to allow China to join the agreement. For some CPTPP members, the prospects of boosting their exports by expanding their access to the massive Chinese market may also provide a significant inducement to support its membership. Singapore and Malaysia, for example, have already signaled their support for China's membership bid. Others, though, such as Japan and Australia, have been far more wary. A growing number of countries have been targets of China's trade aggression, which has made them concerned about entering into new trade agreements and deepening their trading relations with China. And this is, of course, something that Canada has experienced firsthand. In retaliation for Canada's participation in the Huawei extradition case, China blocked many Canadian agricultural exports, including pork, beef, soybeans, and canola. These trade restrictions cost Canada an estimated $4 billion in lost exports. And Canada is not alone. China has similarly blocked imports from Australia in retaliation for its calls for an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as Canberra's complaints about CCP interference in Australia's domestic politics. As a destination for nearly 40% of Australia's exports, Beijing's import curbs, which targeted an extraordinarily broad list of agricultural and mining products, are designed really to inflict maximum economic pain on Australia's core export sectors. And these are far from isolated incidents. Beijing has used the threat and imposition of trade restrictions to punish over a dozen countries for various perceived affronts. So what we've seen is China weaponizing trade as an instrument of economic coercion versus weaker states in blatant violation of the rules and principles of the multilateral trading system. Now, besides China, a number of other countries, including South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Taiwan, have all expressed interest in joining CPTPP, and the UK's accession process is already underway. So expanding membership in the agreement is an important way to broaden its scope. And since the WTO's negotiation function is largely paralyzed now due to US-China conflict, this also represents a crucial means to expand and strengthen global trade rules. But CPTPP participants need to be confident that any new member will actually respect and abide by its rules. The logic behind agreements like the CPTPP is that trade should be governed by the rule of law rather than the raw use of power. But in recent years under Xi Jinping, China's approach to trade appears to be driven by Thucydides' maxim that the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. So many countries are increasingly coming to see deeper trade and investment ties with China as a double-edged sword. Greater dependence on the Chinese market, while bringing commercial opportunities, also means greater vulnerability. So there's been hope that under Biden, the US would potentially rejoin the CPTPP as a critical means to repudiate Trump's trade policy, re-engage US allies, and re-engage in the Asia-Pacific. But instead, what we've seen is the Biden administration largely continuing Trump's trade policy, and efforts to increase US engagement in Asia have been extremely limited. It looks highly unlikely now that the US will rejoin CPTPP, given opposition to new trade agreements in Congress and the Biden administration's focus on domestic policy. So the US strategy right now seems to be centered primarily on trying to reach some kind of additional trade agreement in the region. But compared to China's full court press to deepen trade and investment ties in the region, this would be extremely weak. And it's also extremely weak compared to the significance of rejoining the CPTPP, for example. The US's current strategy now is widely seen as simply too little, too late. So this absence of US engagement or any kind of a concerted strategy for trade and investment in the region has created a major opening for China that it's been very proactive and successful in taking advantage of. So I'll wrap up there and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kristen. And we turn to Jennifer and some of the earlier comments, Jeff's comments about identity and Southeast Asian nationalism, I think will speak to what you are interested in. So it's yours, Jennifer.
Thank you. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here. Thinking about what I can add to what has already been said, I thought I could draw on some of my ongoing research around regional discourses and practices of security, broadly understood, in relation to both these shifts in great power geopolitical dynamics and, of course, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, the last time I spoke at one of these DSF webinars was in July of last year. And it actually makes sense to pick up on some of the things that we discussed then. So for example, we talked about how regional associations like ASEAN tend to operate in ways that allow for a lot of informal and flexible dealings with each other and with external great powers, despite what may or may not be going on with regards to strategic competition between the United States and China and other things going on in that regard. And, regional actors out of necessity have long honed the sort of skills required to navigate tricky relationships and thorny and controversial issues. And in a lot of ways, this is in fact the modus operandi of ASEAN. And I think the fact that many of the regional institutions that do exist have had to capture the complexity of how their members might not always actually share core ideas, aligned around things like Western style liberal norms, even as they agree that order, and the agency that Elina mentioned is really important. And this gives the region an edge in terms of maintaining resilience. And we can say that something that has generally been true, especially about regional state-to-state relations, is the degree to which these are actors that are always walking tightropes in their relationships, balancing them. And so they are well poised to survive and even thrive in change-ups in the global order. Now, on the other hand, it's precisely because of this flexibility that actors in the Asia-Pacific, as a group or as subgroups, can sometimes struggle to formulate coherent regional responses to significant events and ongoing challenges. Whether we're talking about an urgent crisis, such as a disease pandemic, or a significant security issue, such as escalating tensions between the US and China, or to managing longer-term policy challenges regarding, collective action problems like climate change. So the other point worth picking up from our previous webinar is that, in the case of strong state models of comprehensive security, we know that sometimes there can be a sinister side, for lack of a better term, to regional success stories in handling the pandemic. So various aspects of COVID responses that ostensibly aim to protect the general populations, and in many cases have succeeded in that regard. There have been some remarkable vaccination rollouts, some really, really effective health measures and movement control orders. Nevertheless, sometimes they have caused, some groups already subject to disproportionate state surveillance or control to find themselves even more affected by what we might call the unjust exercise of power by the state or by ruling elites, either because COVID can serve as a distraction or because COVID response has in some instances been used as a catalyst for power consolidation through expanded emergency powers, for example. Now, importantly, to a degree, this is true of all states. But because of the sort of strong state disposition of a lot of governments in the region, including those that are otherwise democratic, there's often a disconnect, between what we can say is good for ruling governments versus what is good for people in general. So the last thing I want to talk about is how current shifts in regional order are affecting regional policy and practices that take place, beyond track 1, so in track 1.5 and beyond. And as it happens over the past year or so, I've been doing some research and writing on, among other things, the dynamics and implications of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the region, including, by the way, co-authoring an analysis of regional WPS national action plans with Stephanie Martel and Sarah Sharma that will be published very soon as a DSF paper, so that's a shameless plug. And I also recently attended CSCEP's second round of WPS study group meetings as Canada's representative. And what's really interesting is that, WPS work and WPS adjacent work in the region is a good example to examine some of these dynamics of what we've been discussing here. And I think brings to light both the frictions and opportunities for regional cooperation to meet challenges associated with long-term policy agendas in a shifting regional environment. So importantly, You know, there's a lot of really impactful and interesting WPS work being done in the region. Some things are happening at the regional level with things like joint ministerial statements, a new registry of WPS experts, at the governmental level, state level, through things like national action plans or related programs. And also there's a lot that is occurring regionally in these sort of vibrant networks of epistemic and practice communities in tracks 2 and beyond, even between actors in countries that do not have, you know, good formal security or diplomatic relations with one another, which is fairly remarkable. So notably, all of this work is being affected, often negatively, both by the pandemic and by these recent trends in geopolitics. So for the former, the impacts have included, you know, the obvious health implications of the spread of COVID, which disproportionately affects women, both in professional and domestic spheres, and also through program interruptions and resource strains caused by spending freezes and movement control measures and the like. And for the latter, everyone in the WPS communities seem to agree that, you know, great power politics and escalating geopolitical tensions between the big regional actors is absolutely unhelpful for all the work that is already always happening on these issues. So again, there we see resource strains, diversions of attention, reductions of capability, and political tensions, potentially causing threats to active working relationships and so on. So there's a lot of inherent ambiguity and uncertainty in the regional discussions of whether or not something like a regional action plan on WPS is even possible or desirable. We can connect some of that to some of what we've discussed here today with regards to the post-colonial sentiments around ideas or institutions that can be linked to sort of Western concepts. But within the space, there's also, you know, the potential for increased tensions and contestation, even as it may provide opportunity for new modes of governance to open up. So sometimes we can see that strangeness and ambiguity and uncertainty can operate as modes of governance and offer opportunities for new approaches to complex challenges. And I know something that interests me is wondering about, you know, what kinds of interactions become possible in these sorts of assemblages of practice and discourse that may not be possible at the formalized state-to-state track 1 level. Now, I'll just end by saying, you know, that we do often forget when we're talking about international relations to consider how it's important to look both inside and outside the state, but also in these gray zones and liminal interstitial spaces of regional governance when trying to understand something like regional security. So a robust analysis of regional order really requires us, I think, to persistently zoom in and out from great power politics to regional organizations, to individual state security concerns, to civil society and grassroots movements, and all along these various tracks. So I think panels like this are excellent examples of that, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. We have a second webinar coming up, which is going to pick up on the transnational and civil society dimensions, but I think it's very important that we keep this component front of mind when we're talking about the more hard-edged traditional security concerns. So next we have Shaun Narine of St. Thomas University and in New Brunswick. And Kirsty has worked out a technical workaround, I'll call it, which will bring Shaun into our discussion. I'm not quite sure the magic that she's using, but it's over to you, Kirsty, and then, of course, to Shaun. Hello, Shaun, can you hear us? Looks like we're getting an automated version of Shaun at the moment. let's give this a few moments to develop. Because I wonder if we have the bandwidth to support what you're trying to do, Kirsty.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Can you hear Shaun?
No, and the video is very
Great.
shall we say spotty in terms of hearing and seeing
Okay.
him.
Shaun, can you speak into your home phone, the landline? Speak into your landline and I will hold it to the computer. It worked for a previous webinar. We'll try this out. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Reasonably clear. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, Shaun.
Okay. Well, all right. I'll try to speak as clearly as I can, and hopefully this will actually work. Can you see me at all, or is this just my voice?
Thus far, just your voice.
Okay. Well, you don't need to see me. I'm not that good looking. All right. Well, what I'm going to do is, I of course have not heard anything anyone else has said, and I suspect what I'm about to say may be completely and totally different from everything else everyone else has said. So I apologize in advance if that's the case. I'm actually going on. I'm following on sort of something that Brian suggested. Brian asked that I sort of expand on, or he's queuing on an op-ed that I did for our Lines group, arguing for the need for Canada to avoid falling in line with line discrimination. On that, I'm going to make the argument for why Canada should not get pulled into a U.S.-defined agenda towards the Asia Pacific. I'm going to argue that Canada needs its own approach to China based on our own political, economic, and demographic realities. Most of my critique is going to focus on the weaknesses of the United States and why it's not advisable for us to continue to reflexively tie ourselves to American policies. But I'm also interested in why this conflict is happening at all. I think that Canada is part of a group of Western countries that have dominated the world for 200 years and profited enormously as a result. That domination is now under challenge, and a lot of our reaction to the rise of China is driven by our desire to maintain our privileges. Instead, I think we should be finding ways to accommodate China and accept change. So that's the basic argument I'm making. So let me flesh this out. So I'm going to make 4 arguments, put forward 4 different ideas. The first argument I'm going to make is that the United States has a tendency to misinterpret the world and often to catastrophic effect. This reality alone means that Canada should not be following the American on important issues like relations with China. Let me illustrate this point by asking the question, why does the United States lose so many of its wars? Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but one simple answer is that it doesn't understand its enemies. More accurately, it makes little effort to understand how others see themselves. Instead, it filters relations with its enemies, or with actors who it often makes into enemies, through the lens of its own nationalist myths and narrow self-interest. I argue much of the Cold War was like this. Certainly the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and the Afghanistan War are all examples of this tendency. Now the U.S. is doing the same to China. It is defining China as an existential threat when China clearly is no such threat to the United States. The Biden administration is trying to pitch its growing conflict with China, a conflict I'd argue that the U.S. started and exacerbated as a global contest between democracy and authoritarianism. The fact is that most authoritarian states pose no real threat to Western democracies. In fact, the reverse is often true. Canada should not adopt American language or interpretations of the world. We need to recognize that the U.S. frequently manufactures threats to justify its own aggression. My second argument is the flip side of the first. If we should be concerned about American foreign policy making, we need to be even more concerned about what is happening inside the United States. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the U.S. today is probably the greatest security threat that Canada faces, while also being our major trading partner. We share a border with the most powerful country in the world that is in an advanced state of political and social decay. The U.S. can plausibly be described as a failing state and failing democracy. The social and political divisions within the country are profound. The government is remarkably dysfunctional. Legal corruption among American legislators is endemic. One of the two major political parties has become openly authoritarian and anti-democratic. The U.S.'s remarkable mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic is an indisputable illustration of all of this. More than 700,000 Americans and counting have died in the pandemic. According to Deborah Birx, one of the Trump administration's medical advisors, the first 100,000 deaths may have been unavoidable. After that, they were all preventable. None of this supports the contention that the U.S. is a capable or reliable hegemonic actor. Significantly, the churning political and social forces within the U.S. can easily lead to dangerous foreign policy actions. In light of this, Canada has to be concerned about ideological and political contamination leaking across the border. As difficult as it may be to imagine, Canada also needs to diversify its economic and political relations with the world to reduce our dependency on the U.S. There's simply no point in tying ourselves to the Titanic as it goes down. The third argument is that Canada also needs to appreciate the significant demographic changes taking place within our country. Within the next 15 years, 45% working-age Canadians, according to Statistics Canada, will be visible minorities. These are mostly people of Asian background. By 2050, Canada may well be a majority Asian state. That is an enormous opportunity, but it also has implications for our relations with the United States and Asia. The ethnic Chinese community in Canada is not a monolith, of course, and there are many tensions from Asia that could end up becoming relevant to Canadian politics. But this is a development that should require Canada to have a more sophisticated approach to China. The fourth argument is that Canada is a status quo power. We've done very well in the Western-dominated world order. It makes sense that we should like to maintain those advantages and privileges. Being reflexively differential in the United States is a critical part of our strategy. But it was inevitable that Western domination of the globe would eventually give way to the emergence of a more complex, multipolar world. And that is what is happening now. It is entirely reasonable that the most populous country on Earth, with the world's biggest economy, at least by purchasing power parity, would expect to exercise political power on the global stage. Our objective should be trying to figure out how to accommodate China in the world system. That means being considerably less self-righteous in our foreign policy approach. The discovery of unmarked graves of Indigenous children in Canada, coming shortly after Canada formally accused China of genocide in Xinjiang, may have been embarrassing, but it also illustrated a critical point. The Canada of today, the successful multicultural liberal democracy, is built on the atrocities of yesterday. The same is true of many, if not most, Western democracies with their histories of colonialism and genocide. The fact is that Canada cannot be an example for the rest of the world to follow. We have no credible guidance to offer other countries. At the least, this realization should make us less arrogant on the world stage. We may push for human rights and political reforms in authoritarian states, but we should do so with much more humility. Canada presents itself as a supporter of international law and multilateral institutions. But Canada is also highly inconsistent in how and against whom it pursues those goals. It's telling that we condemn China's treatment of Uyghur people, but remain effectively silent about the suffering of Palestinians. It's commendable that we call for a rules-based international order in the Asia-Pacific, and we've never emphasized the U.S. invasion of Iraq as the illegal and incredibly damaging act that it was, and acknowledged its implications. Canada needs to promote and maintain multilateral structures and international law. These institutions matter more, not less, in a multipolar world. They are a natural ally for a middle power. But Canada has to work to have these institutions apply equally to all the great powers, not just the ones we find threatening. And so far, our inconsistencies in supporting our purported values have made it easy to dismiss Canada's criticisms as little more than their political theater. And that's my editorial comment, so I'm finished.
Thank you, Shaun. It's unfortunate you weren't able to join or listen earlier, because certainly what you said resonates with what Jeff had said, one of Jeff's points earlier, and also with what several others have suggested about Canadian policy and Canadian attitudes towards the Asia Pacific. I want to thank all of our participants, in fact, in being ahead of time a bit by a few minutes. I didn't think we'd have quite this length of time for questions, and I'd encourage participants to put them into the Q&A section. I'll try and pick them up as we go along. We've got one question that's quite specific about Myanmar. I'll hold that one for a moment and pick up on another question which has to do with AUKUS. And I think there were a number of aspects of this that came up in the discussion, and I would look to panelists to reflect on different aspects. First of all, the U.S. is adopting what I would characterize as a militarized agenda towards Asia Pacific. It's curious, actually, that none of you as panelists have emphasized that, and perhaps that either suggests you don't think it's that important, or you think it's futile, or you think it's important and didn't mention it. But if I listen to or look to webinars from key institutions from the US government and otherwise, it is dominated by the notion of military competition with China is necessary to prevent or to delay, if you will, prevail against an existential threat. And so I guess I'd start, and the question that initially is focused at Jeff and Elina, who took certainly different angles on this. But is AUKUS, and I'll associate that with the U.S. alliance strategy towards the Asia Pacific, is it in your view, a useful or a potentially effective, that's a more better way to put it, strategy vis-a-vis the Asia Pacific? And I'll start with you, Jeff.
Thanks, Professor Job. I think I completely agree with the underlying assumption that the U.S. approach to the Asia Pacific is heavily predicated on its alliance system and the use of its military, both for dialogue and diplomacy. Lots of what you see the United States doing, engaging with countries like Vietnam, is run through its Department of Defense and not through its Department of State. A lot of those relationships that we talk about as being indicative of a U.S. Broad buy-in to a U.S. vision of the region, they do hang on a military hook rather than a kind of Department of State diplomacy. I think we can talk about why that's the case. Fundamentally, I think for the United States to get anything done, and certainly anything funded on a large scale, attaching it to a defense budget is much easier than moving it through Congress, as we saw with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and how difficult it is to engage on economic terms through FTAs within the region. The U.S. always has a paid for and planned means of using the military to engage within the Asia Pacific. Right. And it's become the default way that we've engaged. And I've worked in that sphere and know that that's certainly an important part of how we do diplomacy now, or the United States does diplomacy in the Asia Pacific. I don't think that long-term it's effective. I really think that what ends up happening is that you create a situation where the United States is using one of many state measures of engagement over reliance on that point. We are not, the United States is not seen as a progressive actor around FTAs. It's not seen as an effective diplomatic actor on the State Department side, certainly not in comparison to its engagement on DoD fronts. And I think long-term, that's, again, out of line with the way that the region is moving. There's much more of a focus on economic development, economic interconnection as being a source for stability, on a preference for negotiated outcomes to potential conflict mitigation. Again, go back to this idea of a code of conduct for the South China Sea. I mean, this is a very real thing. And when you talk to ASEAN member states and you talk to China, it's a slow process. It's certainly one that will be controversial if they ever reach it, because ultimately we'll have to engage with international maritime law and UNCLOS, and there's a whole bunch of tricky bits to it. But fundamentally, there's no support for it on the US side because it could limit the ability to conduct freedom of navigation, or as US commanders often say, the ability of the US to fly, sail, or operate anywhere allowed by international law. And so those continue to be, I think, the way that the US looks at the region. And certainly that's often how we or the United States approaches China through the lens of defense and security.
I'll put you down as undecided, right? Elina, the question, in some ways, a question came in that was focused more specifically, which is what changes would make AUKUS a less controversial partnership for Southeast Asia? Now, your answer may be none of them would, but be interested in your take. Let's assume that AUKUS goes forward. How does that place the Southeast Asian states?
I think a minimum mitigating factor would have been regional consultations. But given the fact that even people within Australia's DFAT were largely unaware that this development was going to be announced, I think hoping for that consultation to precede the announcement is a bit too far of a stretch. I will agree with you, Brian, that the US has an overly militarized approach to the region. And I didn't mention it because it's a given fact. When you look at the number of bases in the region, the number of operations, military operations, as well as joint exercises, I mean, they far outweigh any military cooperation with China that the region has. Is it effective? I don't think so. Not in the long term, as Jeff said. One way I think that the US is trying to address this, to be fair to them and trying to balance out that military approach, is to go the tech route. And I mentioned this in my remarks on standards, a competition over international standards related to tech, but also to what Kristen mentioned about this fixation on trying to complete some sort of digital trade arrangement as sort of a filler for the lack of a comprehensive economic approach to the region.
Thank you. It brings me to a question I put first to Kristen, but also Jeff mentioned it was the notion of increased economic integration among Asia-Pacific states. And yet at the same time, what you see is the US purposely devising a strategy to in fact separate China from cooperation in any form of what they regard as sensitive security-related issues, of which they take a very, very broad definition. And so, Kristen, is this an agenda that really doesn't have much capacity, or is it an agenda that can, in effect, halt what has been going on in terms of integration, both across the Pacific, but if you will, given US extraterritorial reach with regard to companies and technology, is it an agenda that will in effect have consequences for Asia-Pacific states themselves?
That's a great question. I think it's a difficult one to answer. And, requires a bit of a crystal ball to see how these things may play out. And I think that's difficult. Whether it will halt or sort of impede regional integration, it's hard to say. I mean, it could have the opposite effect. It could hasten regional integration, depending on how things play out. One thing we do know is it's going to lead to likely just introducing massive inefficiencies. You have many Asian countries that are at the heart of these global supply chains, particularly in technology products, essentially having to create two separate supply chains potentially to serve US and Chinese dominated markets in a world of decoupling. Massive disruption, massive inefficiency that will bring down growth in the region and globally. Which has, huge economic consequences in addition to the geopolitical consequences. So it's It's extremely difficult to see how these decisions by the US on technology are going to play out long term. I think there's huge uncertainty here. And the consequences will be massive, but it's very difficult to know how this will play out.
Well, I'll put a very specific question to you. What are the consequences for Canada as the U.S., if you will, intensifies its efforts to preclude technical cooperation and trade and technology with China?
Well, certainly Canada will be affected by this, but much less so than other countries like Taiwan and others in the region that are so central to many of these technology sectors. We'll be finding ourselves caught between the US and China in a world of decoupling and trying to figure out how to organize our exports and our economy and what the implications will be. But on the tech side, certainly there are countries that are much more deeply implicated than Canada is.
True. We've had a question in the Q&A, and I'm sure others have raised it, but it has to do with the Canadian take on Asia Pacific. And in response to both Jeff and especially you, Shaun, the response to people who argue as you have that Canada should have an independently conceived and a relatively independent attitude strategy towards the Asia Pacific meets with two, if you will, objections. One is the antipathy towards China being increasingly seen by the Canadian public and by Canadian politicians as an authoritarian state that we should not particularly deal with. And the other concern you get from individuals considering Canada and Asia is the US is the central determining factor in Canadian policy. And therefore, we either go along because we enjoy it or we go along because we have to. So I'll put it first to you, Shaun, if you can relate as you did through this indirect connection with Kirsty.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, first off, I would totally agree. I think I mentioned in my presentation that imagining Canada taking a more independent state from the United States is difficult. Where we're economically, militarily, politically dependent and integrated. On the other hand, though, if the United States is, I would see, given what's happening in the United States today, there's at least going to be the next 10 to 15 years of it working out whether or not it's even going to be a democracy. So from a certain point of view, we're going to have to deal with this particular issue just politically. Now, what is our relationship with the United States? How far are we going to let events within it affect or determine or shape our own responses to the world? The demographic element that I pointed out, I think, in some ways is even more urgent because, the United States is becoming, over time, the Hispanic population is going to be the largest single group in the country. In Canada, we're heading ethnically in a very different direction. And I think that, again, I don't know how we're going to work this out, but I think that the imperative to work out something is going to get greater and greater as time goes on, as these ethnic, demographic, and other changes between the two countries, including possibly our politics, become more and more pronounced. So I don't have any easy solution to that other than to say that it could be that these forces are happening and they're going to force us to be more inventive in how we deal with the rest of the world. But I realize that's a very, very poor kind of response. I mean, in many ways, you can argue we're simply caught with the United States and whatever it does, we're going to have to accept. Now, I don't actually buy that. I think that, if we're an independent state, if we're following a different set of premises, then we can make that argument to our population. Now, I do agree that China's perception in Canada has become extremely negative, and many people say it's an authoritarian state. We need to reject it, resist it, etc. This is part of the reason I try to point out that our own history is quite colorful on these things. And I do believe that part of the problem we've had for the past 3 years is Canada's been part of a sort of a liberal approach to the world that's become extremely aggressive. And we have this sense that we can somehow force values or change the world in ways that we want to see it. And this is highly unrealistic. We have to appreciate the fact that different states are going to develop at different rates of their own and with different sorts of historical and other forces and factors the way we did. And we're going to have to simply I think we're going to have to shift our mindset on this. And this is where I think the politicians can actually be a little bit more creative and useful. You don't have to take an uninhibitedly antagonistic approach to China. You actually can look more constructively at your own past and say, all right, what can we learn about our own past mistakes, and how can we use that to take a more nuanced approach to dealing with the country? So whether we condemn a place or we take a more nuanced approach, I think is something that political leadership can actually shape. And what's happening in Canada right now is that our political leadership has been quite, at least some of it has been quite black and white, when we in fact require much more gray.
Okay, thank you, and it's good to be able now to see you. The notion of creative and useful politicians is an interesting one, but I'll turn to you, Jeff, for any further comment on this, especially as your foundation has struggled, I would use the word, with this issue.
I think that's fair to say. It's a tricky situation, to be sure, considering public opinion of China and understanding that the public opinion shapes policymakers' sense of options in many ways. I think I just make one fundamental point, and here I'd kind of reference Richard Armitage, the former Deputy Secretary of State, when he said, in order to get an Asia policy right, you have to get your China policy right. In order to get your China policy right, you have to get your Asia policy right. And I think that's a truism for the Asia Pacific, that you can't approach the region and expect to be a welcomed actor and integrate into institutions and have healthy, sustainable relations at the state and sub-state level with any Asian state without understanding the influence that China has in the region, and the fact that in many instances, China has a veto over whether or not you're going to be engaged in institutions that are becoming increasingly influential and important around issues including human rights and economic development and social justice and international law. So I think that turning one's back on China isn't an option. Fundamentally, foreign policy is determined by national interest. National interest is best projected and best ensured by engagement where and when possible, short of conflict. And in this instance, I think Australia serves as a precautionary tale to Canada, where we used to talk about Australia being a model that we should emulate in the Asia Pacific. To me now, Australia's approach to China is a warning to Canada not to adopt an inherently adversarial approach to China. Ultimately, what it means is you limit your room for maneuver in the region and increase your dependence on the United States as a security provider and a security partner.
Thank you.
Brian, can I jump in for a second as well?
Sure, please do. I was going to go to you next.
Oh, okay, sorry. No, but I wanted to add actually to what's already been said. I share Jeff's feelings about the phraseology Indo-Pacific, and to quote Regina George, despite us trying to make it happen, I don't know if it's going to happen. It is sort of an imaginary region that is born of very specific perspectives from kind of the Anglosphere, right? The US Anglosphere. And I think that addresses one of the questions in your Q&A here from Jacob from Balsillie. And, one of the things that has frustrated me as a scholar of the region as well is this tendency to be preoccupied with the great power politics over trying to understand, the actors in the region that aren't China or the United States. And, there's this tendency to talk about and understand and analytically and pragmatically approach the region from here, mostly through the point of view of American security interests. And as we all know, I think we've all said it in varying degrees, this is a flawed approach, right? Because, it underestimates the significance of the East Asian actors themselves, right? The hub and spokes model doesn't really tell us about the strategic goals or domestic politics or relationships that East Asian actors have with each other, and not just with China or with the United States. And I do think that the singular focus on kind of American actions and interests and the commentary on the issue is problematic empirically, but also from a practice perspective, right? So, I mean, I'm repeating a little bit what's been said, but also, you know, just emphasize that, you know, so much about what world order looks like or global order or regional order looks like also, you know, can't really be divorced from the way that we talk about it and understand it and frame it. And there's a close connection between, you know, the epistemic communities of security and security policy.
Right.
You know, I was recently involved in the CGS conversation, or sorry, CG conversations,
Right.
Around kind of crafting a new Canadian foreign policy. And yeah, I mean, I was struck by some of these themes emerging in those discussions, right? There were practitioners and academics and experts in the room. And yeah, there is sort of this kind of singular preoccupation with either the Americans or the Chinese and their strategic interest in the region. But I just think that maybe the single most important thing that, you know, the Canadian foreign policy and security establishment can do is to make sure, you know, to echo, I think, what everybody's said here, that we're not just kind of jumping onto those trains of conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Elina, over to you with a two-pronged sort of question. How does I mean, I'm curious, and I'm sure there's a simple answer, but I think you'll give me a complex answer, which is Southeast Asia's response to this notion of the Anglosphere. When I saw the announcement of AUKUS, I basically saw both Boris and the Australian Prime Minister essentially rejoicing in the notion that it was an Anglo-spheric undertaking. And I'm curious as to how that resonates in Southeast Asia. The other thing is, I'm curious also about how China is perceived, because you talked about what I took to be the independence and agency of ASEAN. But there have been, and there are increasingly examples of where China has been able to dominate individual ASEAN members to the detriment of there being a unified ASEAN voice, even to the point of reaching statements to conclude meetings. And so I ask you, I think, to think about this, what I would regard as contrary pressures, if you will, on Southeast Asian states who scholars say resort to hedging. And does hedging work? And be interested in your points of view. There's lots there to pick up on.
Yeah, so the response to this rejoicing of the return of the Anglosphere wasn't very explicit. Jeff mentioned that if you look at the statements of the Indonesian and Malaysian governments, that's probably the closest that you're going to get in terms of a pushback against this idea. Part of it, I think, is the desire to not want to cast terms solely within that framing. But there is a shadowing of this idea that the colonial powers are looking to return to the region, and that elicits some concern and anxiety. I know a number of commentators have said, well, look at the other responses, look at the Philippines and Singapore and Vietnam. I would actually disagree with any implication that there was some sort of reception, a positive reception to AUKUS from those statements. I think if you look very carefully at those statements, you'll see that they were rather circumspect. Secretary Loksin's tweets, of course, were not circumspect at all. They were very welcoming of AUKUS. But then if you look at Harry Rock, the presidential spokesman's statement, he seemed to suggest that President Duterte himself had concerns. And as we look to the ASEAN summits next week, not quite sure what the Philippines' position will turn out to be by then. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the region about AUKUS and what it means for regional stability. On China, certainly there are pressures that China has brought to bear on some particularly smaller Southeast Asian states. And we all remember the 2012 episode very well. Cambodia will never be allowed to live that down. And I think there are real concerns as Cambodia looks to resume its chairmanship of ASEAN next year. It's ASEAN, I mentioned agency. I didn't mean to suggest that ASEAN has figured it out. It is grappling with this sense of agency. And we see it particularly with the case of Myanmar. I know there was a question about Myanmar in the Q&A, but specifically within the construct of this great power competition, there are opposing and contrasting pressures that are being brought to each and every Southeast Asian member state, ASEAN member state, in different functional areas. I mentioned technology, but obviously the economy, even diplomatic relations.
Elina, I'll put the specifics of the question about Myanmar to you, and that is, in reading it, it says it's foot dragging on development of a roadmap to peace by the junta in Myanmar, causing serious harm to the reputation and effectiveness of ASEAN. But I note, I just read that, in fact, ASEAN states are not going to allow the declared head of state of Myanmar to participate, which is, I think, a fairly significant gesture on the part of ASEAN.
It is, and I think the expectation for ASEAN to have done more over the past few months stems from a lack of understanding about what ASEAN can and cannot do fundamentally. And this misunderstanding is also among Southeast Asians themselves. So I think ASEAN was caught in the sense that there were all these questions about, well, why didn't ASEAN as a grouping set out a timeline for these 5 proposals to be met? And if ASEAN did that, then it would be digging its own grave, because those deadlines ASEAN well knew were not going to be met. And this idea of prioritizing procedure, sometimes even over substance, is very much alive in ASEAN. The idea that, we all know the criticism of ASEAN being a talk shop, but talking is very important in order to cultivate trust and confidence. It doesn't always work, as we've seen multiple times. It's been a challenge to get to even the point that we are at now, where Min Aung Hlaing was not invited to the ASEAN summits. But a lot of that has to do with the personalities involved in this particular development. And that was a result of the Malaysian, Indonesian, as well as Singaporean, and then Bruneians as well behind the scenes that really made this decision that is seen as a bit of a change from the norm for ASEAN.
Thank you. Got a specific question, I'll put it out, from Jacob at Balsillie School and Waterloo. Wonders if panelists think that Canada's enhanced participation in security forums like Shangri-La Dialogue and the ADMM+ meaningfully reflect a change in the shift towards an Indo-Pacific strategy. Broaden the question a little bit to suggest that Canada's participation in Shangri-La has been episodic at best if one looks to the participation of the defense minister himself. And also on the ADMM+, Canada is not a member. And so I guess the question I'll refocus to those of you who want to pick up on it is, what should Canada's next steps be in terms of participation in security-related institutions in the Asia-Pacific? Should we be anxiously pushing, for instance, to join the East Asia Summit? Should we be pursuing independent, I'll use the word middle power initiatives, or should we simply join, as some argue, we should ask to join the Quad and support AUKUS? I'll put that out there for you all, someone to volunteer. Otherwise, I'll start pointing fingers. You can't remain silent, Jeff, can you? Go for it.
I have my mute button on though. So,
Yes.
I think fundamentally, any cornerstone of a Canadian engagement towards the region has to be focused on institutionalism and engagement. And I would say, as broad as you can go and as inclusive as you can go in terms of participation, where it makes sense in line with Canadian national interests, should be the default approach of any government. You can call it omnidirectionality, right? It's what the Japanese government prioritized in the post-Cold War years, and it's what China has used in its approach, right? Make as many relations with as many institutions in as many states as possible and establish those lines of communication. And those become the fundamental basis for your diplomacy in the region. And then I'd say integrating across those and going as deep as possible, because in many of ASEAN being a good example, you have the higher level dialogues that take place, the ADMM plus, all of the different security discussions, the plus mechanisms, but there are also a number of working groups where a lot of discussions take place, and that's where in many instances the action is actually determined. Right, and where state engagement and sub-state engagement is actually formulated and structured, and Canada is absent in those.
Thank you. I'll cut you off there because we have 3 or 4 minutes remaining, and make a comment and ask each of you for a 30-second soundbite. If I've been a listener to this webinar, I get the sense of an inevitable movement by China to become the dominant force within the region, and that this proceeds certainly on the economic and the technical sides. And in that sense, are we looking at, as I put it, an inevitable success largely to the Chinese agenda? And as I said, I'll give each of you about 30 seconds, a yes, no, and one quick reason because. I'll leave you to the last, Jeff, but go to you, Elina, first.
It's a pending success. So I think my soundbite is that it's really important, just to echo what Jennifer said earlier, to look at what is going on in the region, not through great power lens, but through the lens of the capitals within the region itself. And that way it allows for the nuances to come through a little more clearly rather than superimposing perspectives from the outside.
Thank you. Kristen, you're next.
I would say no, China's dominance is not inevitable, in part because it faces massive domestic economic challenges still. It's not clear whether the China boom will go bust, but certainly it faces growing challenges that might interrupt its rise.
Thank you. Jennifer.
I feel like it's like a speed thing. So I would say that U.S. hegemony and the kind of predominance of liberal internationalism globally is not yet in any kind of dire threat. I think that's a really important point to make. But there are overlapping security mechanisms, right, at play. There is sort of security type communities and regimes that emerge in the region, and there's also networks, right? And lots of different relationships that are occurring at all these different levels. So yes, obviously China will continue to be a dominant actor in the region. But this isn't just strategic, right? There are lots of different relationships going on. And there is trade and economic interests. There are there's lots of track 2 stuff happening.
Okay, you've had that's your sound bite. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Shaun.
It's complicated.
Yes, it's complicated. Thank you, Shaun. Can you?
Yeah, well, I guess I don't think anything is inevitable, of course, but I do think that we are heading towards a multipolar world, a more complex world. I think the opportunities for a country like Canada are considerable in that world, but we need to do it in a diplomatic way. I think I agree with what Jeff said about this. We need to engage in the regional institutions. No, we shouldn't join AUKUS or the Quad or any of these other quasi-military things. It's only going to make the situation worse. But I think we have to, as I said, the Western time is over, or at least it's more complicated. We need to appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. And Jeff, a final soundbite.
I would fundamentally agree with Kristen about the challenges internally to China. I would just add to that there's always the recipient states as well, and there's so much changing on the ground within governance and economics in BRI partner states that's another known unknown. And we've seen how COVID can disrupt everything. So throw in a black swan event and you know, uncertainty becomes the defining feature of the system.
I think we'll end on that definitive note, as it were. I'd like to thank all the panelists for participating, keeping your remarks to the point. I think we engaged in and got drawn into some sophisticated discussions of the region, its dilemmas or dilemmas of states within the region, strategies that states are pursuing, and opens the door, I think, for further discussion. Thank you. The webinar will be recorded and posted for any who wish to listen for the first time, or if you will, catch another listen to one of the participants. So thanking to the panelists, but also obviously thanking Kirsty. There's been some technological magic here, bringing Shaun into the picture. It's just so much easier to work a webinar when you've got you have a competent real host, as it were, and that's been Kirsty. And so thanks, Kirsty. We really appreciate it. I thank all of you who have joined and listened. I hope you found it valuable. And as I said, you can catch up on anything you missed or want to re-listen to on the webinar. I also would conclude by putting a plug in for the second webinar today, if this one focused largely on geopolitical and geostrategic events and crises. This afternoon focuses on intrastate and transnational security. After all, the impact on the populations of the Asia-Pacific is in fact through transnational forces, environmental, pandemic, national, and others. And we'll pick up, I think, on some of the themes that you, Jennifer, mentioned earlier in this session this afternoon. That goes at 12 o'clock my time, 3 o'clock Eastern time. And thanks again, folks, and we'll end at this point.
Thank you.